Spring 1945. Over the skies of southern Germany, a P-47 Thunderbolt slices through the clouds, its wings quivering, its engine howling on the verge of collapse. Below, a German Me-262 jet flashes across the heavens like a streak of molten silver, its twin turbines blazing blue fire. Every Allied pilot knows this fight is suicide. The Me-262 is quicker by nearly 150 miles an hour. No piston-driven aircraft on Earth can overtake it. But today, that certainty is about to die. Inside the Thunderbolt, Lieutenant Jack "Hawkeye" Burns grips the throttle so tightly his knuckles bleach white. He's been pursuing the jet for 30 seconds, an eternity in aerial combat. And somehow, the distance is shrinking. The altimeter spins downward. The airspeed gauge surges past the red line. Every warning light screams for him to ease off. He doesn't. The German pilot glances back and freezes. The American fighter isn't supposed to be there. The Me-262 jerks hard to the right, engines flaring as it tries to escape. Burns dives, rolling into the sun. At this velocity, one mistake means death. He pulls the trigger. 50 caliber tracers rip through the sky, and the impossible unfolds. Sparks erupt across the jet's fuselage. A heartbeat later, the Me-262 bursts into a globe of orange flame. Burns yanks the stick back, gasping for air. His radio crackles with stunned voices. "What the hell did you do, Jack? How'd you catch him?" Burns can't respond. The aircraft feels alive beneath him, thrumming like it's fueled by lightning. The scent of scorched oil fills the cockpit. He glances down at the throttle quadrant, at the faded note penciled in the margin. Mitchell Mix. Use only if you're insane. When Burns lands, the ground crew rushes toward him, expecting wreckage. Instead, they find a machine that shouldn't exist. The exhausts glow cherry red. The engine block is fractured, half melted, yet somehow still running. One officer shouts, "That's impossible!" The mechanics don't reply. They just stare at Sergeant Joe Mitchell, the man who tended Burns's plane, leaning against a fuel drum, arms folded, wearing that familiar half-cocked grin. When the commanding officer storms up, yelling, "What in God's name did you put in that tank?" Mitchell shrugs. "Just a little something I've been brewing." The officer glares. "You could have killed him." Mitchell nods toward the smoking Thunderbolt. "Maybe, but it worked, didn't it?" Silence settles. The engine coughs once more, then dies with a metallic sigh. Mitchell lights a cigarette, smoke curling through the heat. "Sir," he says quietly, "it wasn't the plane. It was the fuel. The officers don't buy it. Yet." But soon the story spreads across every airfield in France. Pilots whisper about the Thunderbolt that outran a jet. Some call it luck. Others call it madness. But one thing becomes certain. Sergeant Joe Mitchell has done what no engineer dared attempt. He's turned ordinary gasoline into fire incarnate, and in doing so, defied both physics and command. The impossible kill over the Me-262 becomes more than legend. It becomes a spark, a riddle. How could a grease-stained mechanic, armed with scrap metal, stubborn will, and a drum of stolen chemicals, create something faster than the most advanced aircraft on Earth? As the officers file their reports, and as the wreckage of the Me-262 smolders in a distant field, Mitchell wipes his hands on a rag and mutters under his breath, "You don't beat the Germans by following the rules. You beat them by rewriting them." And that's exactly what he did. A year earlier, in 1944, the airfields of Normandy were chaos. The Allies had carved runways out of farmland and mud. Planes landed smoking, leaking, shot to pieces. The roar of engines never stopped, and neither did the men who kept them flying. Among them was Sergeant Joe Mitchell, a wiry, sunburned mechanic from Iowa, with grease in his hair and rebellion in his bones. To most of the ground crew, Mitchell was a genius. To the officers, he was a problem. He didn't follow the manual. He wrote it. Where others saw wrecks, he saw challenges. His tent was filled with engine parts, wrenches, and notebooks scrolled with numbers and sketches no one else understood. On the wall above his workbench, a hand-painted sign read, "If it can't fly, it ain't done yet." He'd been a farm boy before the war, fixing tractors with scrap parts and guesswork. "Engines are like people," he'd say. "You push them too hard, they break, but if you know how to talk to them, they'll surprise you." That attitude had already saved dozens of planes, but it also got them into trouble more than once. In August 1944, his commanding officer caught him pouring aviation-grade kerosene into a P-47's fuel tank. "Are you trying to blow us all to hell, Sergeant?" the captain barked. Mitchell didn't flinch. "No, sir. I'm trying to make it faster." The captain stared at him like he was insane. "You're playing with fire," Mitchell smirked. "Fire is how we fly, sir." The truth was, Mitchell had been watching the Luftwaffe closely. He saw German fighters with higher climb rates, sharper acceleration, and engines that screamed past Allied limits. He couldn't stand it. Every time an American pilot failed to make it home because his plane couldn't climb fast enough, it burned Mitchell inside. He started to dream of a way to beat the Germans, not with new planes, but with smarter fuel. The Army Air Forces issued 100-octane AV gas, reliable but predictable. Mitchell wanted unpredictable. He'd read an old engineering manual about methanol injection, a dangerous method to boost power for short bursts. The brass had banned it years ago. Too volatile, too easy to detonate inside the cylinders. But Mitchell figured if he could control the burn rate, if he could tame the explosion, it could turn a standard P-47 into something extraordinary. He began experimenting. After hours, he borrowed methanol drums from the supply depot, claiming they were for cleaning. He siphoned kerosene from storage meant for field heaters. With a battered oil drum as his lab, he began mixing, testing, and failing over and over. Each explosion in his test engine drew curses from nearby tents and warnings from officers. "One day, Joe, you're going to light up half of Normandy," his assistant, Corporal Davis, said. Mitchell just grinned. "If I do, at least they'll see it from Berlin." Rad around the base about the mad mechanic. Some pilots avoided him. Others lined up, begging for a chance to fly one of his modified planes. His methods were unorthodox, but his results were undeniable. Every time his engine tweaks went into combat, the pilots came home. One evening, a young lieutenant named Jack Burns watched him work, curious. "You really think this will make a Thunderbolt faster than a 190? Mitchell looked up, wiping his hands. "Not faster," he said, "but faster long enough." That night, as the camp slept, Mitchell leaned over his latest test mixture, the air thick with the smell of oil and alcohol. He whispered to himself, "If this works, they'll call me crazy. If it doesn't, they'll call me dead." He poured the liquid into a test engine and pulled the starter cord. The motor roared to life with a scream unlike anything he'd ever heard. The whole tent vibrated. He stared at the tachometer and laughed. It worked, and the war was about to change because of it. The next morning, the airfield smelled like smoke and victory. Joe Mitchell stood over the test engine, its casing scorched black, the ground beneath it still warm from the night before. Corporal Davis walked up, eyes wide. "You blew up another one?" Mitchell grinned, wiping his hands with a rag. "Nope. This one lived." Word spread fast. Mechanics from nearby units wandered over, drawn by curiosity or maybe disbelief. They'd all heard of Mitchell's experiments, but seeing the proof was different. The engine, still humming faintly, had clocked an output so far beyond regulation it bordered on insanity. "What the hell did you put in it?" someone asked. Mitchell smirked. "A little farm chemistry?" That farm chemistry was something new. A volatile cocktail of aviation gas, methanol, and trace kerosene mixed in just the right ratio to create what Mitchell called hellfire fuel. It wasn't meant for long flights. It wasn't meant to be safe. It was meant for survival. Short bursts of unrestrained power when everything else failed. He started keeping his formula in a battered notebook wrapped with twine labeled simply, "Do not tell command." Inside, equations scrolled in pencil ran alongside margin notes like, "Too hot, melted piston," and "More methanol equals better climb." Every night, he refined the mix, shaving down the ratios until he found the perfect balance between thrust and destruction. Finally, one night, he poured his refined formula into a spare P-47 engine bolted to a test stand. The engine came alive with a roar that rattled the ground. The prop spun faster and faster until the needle on the RPM gauge buried itself at the end of the dial. Davis shouted over the noise, "It's going to blow!" Mitchell yelled back, "That's how you know it's working." When the test ended, the engine was smoking, but intact. The cylinder heads were glowing but uncracked. The data was clear. The output had jumped by nearly 25%. That kind of increase meant a P-47 could climb faster, run hotter, and outmaneuver anything for a short window of time. Mitchell leaned over the engine, breathing in the fumes. "We just built a jet killer," he said quietly. That night, he made a decision. He would never tell the brass. They'd shut it down, lock it up, and bury it under layers of bureaucracy. Instead, he'd use it in the field quietly, carefully, and only when lives depended on it. Only when lives depended on it. The first batch of Hellfire fuel was mixed in secret behind the hangar in oil drums marked waste. The liquid shimmered faintly in the moonlight. It smelled sharp and chemical. Davis looked uneasy. "If command finds out, we're cooked." Mitchell gave a half smile. "If this works, we'll be heroes. If it doesn't, they won't have to court-martial us. They'll be picking us out of the clouds." He poured the mixture into a P-47 fuel tank, gave the fuselage a pat, and whispered, "Don't let me down." By dawn, the test flight was ready. The pilot, Lieutenant Jack Hawkeye Burns, the only man crazy enough to trust Mitchell completely. Burns climbed into the cockpit, gave a mock salute, and shouted down, "If this kills me, I'm haunting you." Mitchell grinned. "If it doesn't, you'll be buying me a drink." As the Thunderbolt's propeller spun to life, the air seemed to change. The engine roared deeper, sharper, almost animal. The mechanic stepped back as dust swirled and flames licked from the exhaust. It wasn't a normal P-47 anymore. It sounded alive. Burns taxied out, lined up with the runway, and gunned the throttle. The plane shot forward like it had been kicked by God himself, leaving a streak of dust and disbelief in its wake. Mitchell watched it climb, his heart pounding. He whispered, "Go on, prove it to them." And up in the sky, the impossible began. The dawn sky over France was painted with streaks of smoke and sunlight. Lieutenant Jack Hawkeye Burns pushed the throttle forward, and the P-47 Thunderbolt leapt like a living thing. Within seconds, it was clear this was no ordinary flight. The acceleration slammed him into his seat, the dials dancing beyond the red lines as every vibration felt amplified, raw, dangerous. Down on the ground, Joe Mitchell stood with his crew, eyes locked on the tiny silver speck cutting upward through the sky. The roar from the engine was sharper than usual, the tone unfamiliar, almost like a scream. Davis muttered, "That thing's going to blow." Mitchell didn't answer. He couldn't. His jaw was tight, his fists clenched. He was watching his creation, his risk, either fly into history or explode in the air. At 10,000 FT, Burns leveled out. "This bird's angry," he said into the radio, his voice half awe, half fear. "Feels like it wants to jump out of my hands." Mitchell's voice crackled, back calm and steady. "Keep her under 3,000 RPM. The mix burns hot." Burns laughed. "Hot's an understatement, Sarge. I think she's melting the clouds." Then the call came from the operations tent. "Enemy aircraft inbound. A Luftwaffe formation." Maybe 4 planes heading straight toward the coast. The officers ordered Burns to return immediately, but he ignored them. "I'm already up here," he said. "Might as well see what this beast can do." He pulled the Thunderbolt into a climb, scanning the horizon. Within seconds, dark shapes appeared in the distance. Fowler-Wolf 190s, sleek and deadly, slicing through the sky. Burns grinned. "All right, boys. Let's see if this crazy mechanic of mine is a genius or a ghost." The first pass came fast. The Germans dove in formation, guns flashing. Burns rolled left, the Thunderbolt responding faster than it ever had. He fired a burst. 2 rounds struck, and one of the German fighters spiraled down in smoke. "One down!" he shouted. Mitchell and the ground crew cheered, their relief tangled with disbelief. But then came the real test. 2 190s closed in behind him. Normally, a Thunderbolt would dive to escape, relying on its heavy frame to outrun the enemy in a dive. Burns, however, pushed the throttle further forward, past safe limits. The Hellfire fuel ignited at full burn. The plane shot forward like ashel, leaving a gun barrel. The sudden acceleration pinned him back, and the pursuing fighters began to shrink in the distance. Inside the cockpit, the gauges trembled violently. The oil temperature spiked. The engine coughed, then steadied. Burns was grinning now, the adrenaline drowning out the fear. "She's still holding together, Sarge. Whatever you put in this thing, it works." Back on the ground, Mitchell let out a long breath. "Told you," he muttered. "We're rewriting the rule book." After 10 minutes of combat, Burns brought the Thunderbolt back to base, its paint-blistered engine smoking, but intact. The landing gear barely held as it touched down, and when the propeller finally stopped spinning, the silence was deafening. Mitchell and the crew rushed forward. Burns climbed out, soaked in sweat, grinning like a madman. "You just built the fastest damn plane in Europe," he said. The commanding officer arrived seconds later, furious. "What the hell was that stunt, Lieutenant?" Burns saluted with a crooked smile. "Just a test flight, sir." The officer turned to Mitchell. "And you, Sergeant, what did you put in that plane?" Mitchell handed him a small oil-stained notebook. "Science," he said simply, "and a little bit of faith." That night, the base buzzed with rumors. Pilots whispered about the Hellfire Thunderbolt, the plane that moved like a jet. Engineers shook their heads and called it madness. But the results couldn't be ignored. Joe Mitchell's fuel mix had turned an ordinary Thunderbolt into a monster. And for the first time in the war, the mechanics had become as important as the men in the sky. Within 48 hours, every pilot on the base had heard about it. The story spread faster than gunfire. A P-47 Thunderbolt that climbed like a rocket outran German fighters and came home in one piece. They called it the Devil's Jug. Others, half joking, started calling it Mitchell's madness. Either way, the legend was born. The next morning, Captain Dugan, the squadron commander, summoned Sergeant Joe Mitchell to his tent. The air smelled of coffee and kerosene, and tension hung thicker than the cigarette smoke curling toward the canvas roof. "You want to tell me," Dugan said slowly, "why one of my best planes came back looking like it flew through hell and outran the Luftwaffe?" Mitchell didn't blink. "Because it did, sir." Dugan stared at him for a long moment, then cracked a thin smile. "You know the rules say no unauthorized modifications to aircraft fuel systems, right?" "Yes, sir. And that includes whatever witch brew you've been pouring into my tanks." Mitchell crossed his arms. "Sir, the manual also says no plane should survive a head-on with a 190. But here we are." Dugan leaned forward. "What's in it?" Mitchell hesitated. "Methanol blend. High compression burn. Temporary boost. 5 minutes max before meltdown. But for those 5 minutes, the Thunderbolt turns into something else." Dugan's expression shifted from irritation to intrigue. "Can you repeat it?" Mitchell nodded. "Already have." That night, 5 more planes were modified quietly. No paperwork, no signatures, just barrels, hoses, and a handful of trusted mechanics working under cover of darkness. By dawn, half the squadron was running what the crews were now calling Hellfire fuel. When the next mission went up, the results were the same. The Thunderbolts tore through the sky, climbing faster than ever, turning tighter, striking harder. One pilot reported gunning down 2 FW-190s in under 3 minutes. Another came back, claiming he'd chased a German jet until it ran out of fuel. The ground crews called it a miracle. The pilots called it freedom. But miracles always come with a cost. After a week, engines started failing, cylinders warped, pistons cracked, and exhaust ports glowed like molten metal. One Thunderbolt came back trailing smoke so thick it left a black scar across the horizon. Dugan confronted Mitchell again, this time with anger. "You're burning out my planes." Mitchell replied, "I'm keeping your pilots alive." The words hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. Dugan didn't answer right away. He just stared at the rows of planes outside, their cowlings open, their engines glimmering with heat. "You've built something we can't control," Dugan said finally. "You understand that?" Mitchell nodded. "Yes, sir. That's what war is." Despite the risks, the Hellfire modification spread beyond Dugan's squadron. Mechanics from nearby fields came to study the strange method. Some copied it outright, others tried their own versions. The brass never officially approved it, but they didn't stop it either. Results mattered more than regulations now. By late February 1945, reports began circulating through the 9th Air Force. A handful of P-47s were achieving near jet-level speeds in short bursts. Engineers couldn't explain it. The paperwork didn't match the physics. All they knew was that pilots were coming home who otherwise wouldn't have. Joe Mitchell's name was whispered in flight tents and radio chatter. To Themen in the sky, he was a savior. To the officers, he was a ticking bomb. To the officers, he was a ticking bomb. But to the Germans, the ones who watched Thunderbolts dive out of the sun faster than anything that should have been possible, he was a ghost. As one Luftwaffe pilot wrote in his diary, after barely escaping a P-47 ambush, "It climbed as if possessed by the devil. For a moment, I thought the Americans had built their own jet. They hadn't. They'd built something far more dangerous, a mechanic who didn't believe in limits." By March 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its end. But in the airfields of France, Joe Mitchell's creation was burning through more than just fuel. It was consuming engines, steel, and nerves. For every Thunderbolt that came back victorious, another returned limping, its cylinders warped from heat, its oil lines scorched to ash. The mechanics called it Hellfire math. Every extra 30 seconds of boost added another hour of repair. Push it for 2 minutes, the engine was scrap. Push it for 5, the plane was a coffin waiting for a pilot. And yet every man still begged for the mix because it worked. The numbers were undeniable. Squadron kill ratios had doubled in less than a month. Interception success rates jumped 42%. Mission survivability climbed from 71% to 89%. Those weren't just numbers. They were lives. Every percentage point meant another pilot who came home. Another letter that didn't have to be written. But the other numbers haunted Mitchell. He started keeping a private notebook. Hours lost to engine failures. Tons of spare parts burned through. Gallons of methanol stolen or reassigned. The U.S. Army Air Forces had rules for everything. Mitchell's math didn't fit in any of them. One night, Captain Dugan came to his tent holding a stack of maintenance reports. "You know what these say?" he asked quietly. Mitchell didn't answer. Dugan tossed the papers onto the table. "They say your miracle is eating you alive. I've got engines failing mid-air, pistons exploding, and now I've got headquarters asking why I'm requesting more methanol than the entire 8th Air Force." Mitchell didn't look up. "And how many body bags have you filled since we started using it?" The silence between them stretched. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. "This isn't about math anymore, Joe," Dugan said. "It's about control." Mitchell finally looked him in the eye. "You can't control desperation, sir." The words hit harder than either of them expected, because that's what it was, desperation. The fuel mix wasn't just chemistry. It was defiance. Every mechanic, every pilot using it was saying the same thing. "We refused to die quietly. I know, even the supply officers knew. They turned a blind eye when drums went missing, when requisitions didn't add up. Everyone pretended not to notice because the results were too powerful to question. The Hellfire effect had become an open secret, a symbol of American audacity. But the price was coming due. One morning, Mitchell stood in front of a Thunderbolt that had returned from a sortie barely intact. The engine was cracked clean through, the propeller warped, the fuselage peppered with bullet holes. The pilot climbed out, pale and shaking. "She held together, Sarge," he said weakly. "Just barely." Mitchell nodded, trying to smile. But as the pilot walked away, the plane gave a final metallic groan and collapsed, forward, the nose grinding into the dirt. That night, Mitchell wrote in his journal, "Every victory costs something. Every miracle has a receipt." He began calculating the real price, the logistics nightmare he'd created. He realized that his mix had burned through 12 engines in 6 weeks, each worth $25,000. That was over $300,000 in losses, nearly $5 million today, all for one idea that wasn't supposed to exist. And yet, he couldn't stop because the math still made sense. For every destroyed engine, 3 pilots lived. For every reprimand from command, a German fighter went down in flames. War, Mitchell realized, wasn't about who followed the rules. It was about who could afford to break them. And on that calculation, he was winning. April 1945. The war was collapsing, but the skies over Germany still burned every day. The Luftwaffe was fighting to its last breath, and Berlin was a fortress of smoke and desperation. For the U.S. 9th Air Force, one mission remained: what was left of the enemy's air power before the Allies reached the capital. Captain Dugan's squadron was ordered to fly escort for a bomber formation heading deep into German territory. 48 P-47 Thunderbolts, most patched together from weeks of fighting. 10 of them carried something extra. Mitchell's mix stored in canisters under the fuselage. It wasn't on the manifest. It wasn't in the orders. It was just there waiting to turn machines into monsters. At dawn, the roar of engines shook the makeshift runway. The air was so thick with exhaust and tension, it felt like breathing smoke. Lieutenant Jack Hawkeye Burns climbed into his Thunderbolt, running his hand over the note Mitchell had etched near the throttle. "Only if you're crazy," he grinned. "Guess that makes 2 of us, Sarge." Mitchell stood near the runway, watching as the planes lifted off one by one, their propellers flashing in the rising sun. He felt something tighten in his chest. He'd built those engines with his own hands, tuned every piston, risked every rule. If one failed mid-air, it was on him. The formation crossed the Rhine by mid-morning. Below them, Germany looked broken, factories gutted, roads empty, rivers filled with debris. But then the radio crackled. Bandits 11 Tune high. Fast movers. The enemy had arrived. Me. 206-2 jets, sleek and deadly, diving like hawks from the clouds. The bomber crews shouted for cover. The Thunderbolts turned to intercept. But everyone knew the truth. A P-47 couldn't catch a jet, not without hellfire. Burns looked down at his throttle, hesitating only for a second. Then pushed it past the red mark. The engine screamed, shaking the cockpit. The boost hit like a kick to the chest. "She's alive!" he shouted. "Hang on, boys." The P-47 surged forward, the airframe trembling, the wings flexing dangerously. One Mi-262 swept past him, banking hard, but Burns stayed on its tail. Impossible. Insane. He fired a burst. Tracers stitched the sky, and the jet's left engine exploded in flame. "Holy hell!" another pilot yelled. "He got one." He actually got one. The sky turned into chaos. Thunderbolts diving, turning, climbing beyond what anyone thought they could do. 2 more jets fell in flames before the Germans broke formation and fled east. The bombers made it to target unscathed. By the time the squadron returned, their engines were howling, coughing, dying. Burns' plane landed last, smoking from the exhaust. He climbed out, drenched in sweat, grinning ear to ear. "We outran jets, Sarge," he said, slapping Mitchell on the shoulder. "You're officially insane." Mitchell just stared at the wrecked engine. Yeah, he said quietly, but it worked. That night, Dugan gathered his men around a map spread on a crate. Today, we flew into Berlin's backyard, he said, and every bomber came home. That's a first. That's on you, every one of you, and especially this lunatic. He pointed at Mitchell. The crew cheered, but Mitchell didn't smile. He was thinking about the engines he'd broken, the rules he'd shattered, and the line he was crossing every day. War had a way of rewarding madness, and he was starting to wonder what that said about him. Still, as Thiemann celebrated, one thought stayed with him. They said we couldn't catch a jet. Stayed with him. They said we couldn't catch a jet. Today we made them eat their words. He poured a cup of black coffee, staring into the night sky. The distant flashes of anti-aircraft fire over Berlin still glimmered faintly on the horizon. He whispered, "Next time, we won't need luck, just fuel." 3 weeks later, the same squadron was flying again. But this time, the war felt different. Berlin was crumbling. The roads below were jammed with refugees, burned tanks, and shattered trains. The Luftwaffe barely existed, but danger didn't vanish. It just changed its shape. For Joe Mitchell and Captain Dugan's men, the Hellfire mix had become routine, even addictive. The squadron couldn't imagine flying without it. Every sortie began with the same ritual, siphoning fuel, checking valves, whispering the same nervous joke. "If we blow up, tell the brass we were testing innovation." But that morning, something was off. The air was heavy, humid, thick with mist. The ground crews moved slower. Even Mitchell looked uneasy as he handed over the last canister. "Careful with this one," he warned Burns. "The ratio's untested. It might run too hot." Burns winked. Too hot for who? He throttled up and roared down the runway. The mission was a simple sweep. Patrol north of Leipzig. Clear out whatever was left of German resistance. They expected flak, maybe a few ground guns. What they didn't expect was an ambush. Out of the clouds came 6 Focke-Wulf 190s, relics of an air force that refused to die. They dove hard. Guns blazing, Burns banked left, rolling his P-47 into a vertical climb. The world spinning below him. "Engaging!" he shouted. He hit the Hellfire switch. The boost kicked in, raw, violent, almost alive. The P-47 surged skyward, ripping through the mist like a rocket. He fired. One 190 exploded in a fireball. The other scattered. "That's one!" he yelled. Then it happened. A sharp pop, a tremor. The engine screamed. A shrill, metallic death cry. Oil pressure dropped to 0. Smoke filled the cockpit. "Engine's gone! She's gone!" Burns gasped, coughing as black fumes poured through the vents. "Bail out," Dugan ordered over the radio. "Now, Lieutenant." But Burns refused. The plane was still climbing, momentum carrying it higher than it had any right to go. He leveled out just long enough to spot 2 more FW-190s below, chasing one of his squad mates. "Not yet," he muttered. "Not while they're still breathing." He rolled over, diving straight at them. A dead engine, no power, just gravity and fury. The 190s never saw him coming. His guns fired one last burst before the engine locked completely. Tracers tore through the air. One enemy burst into flames. The other veered off. Then silence. The propeller stopped. The cockpit went dark. Burns was falling. At 5,000 odd FT, he yanked the canopy lever and threw himself out. The parachute bloomed behind him, snapping him hard. Below, his Thunderbolt spiraled down, hit a field, and exploded. The last engine Joe Mitchell ever built for him. Hours later, Dugan found Burns limping across the wreckage site, soot-covered Butalev. The only thing he carried was the throttle lever, torn from the cockpit before he bailed out. "Told you I'd bring her home," Burns said weakly. "A base." Mitchell didn't speak for a long time. He stared at the lever, blackened and twisted. The word crazy still scratched into the side. "You flew it until it died," he whispered. Burns nodded. "She gave everything she had." Mitchell wrote in his log that night, "The Hellfire mix bought us speed, bought us kills, bought us time, but every miracle burns out. The question isn't whether it'll last. The question is whether it's worth what it costs. The next morning, the brass ordered an official halt on unapproved modifications. But by then, it didn't matter. The war was nearly over, and so was the age of men like Joe Mitchell, the ones who broke the rules because they couldn't stand watching others die by them. He looked out over the airfield, the rising sun catching the metal wings lined up for their final missions. He smiled faintly. "Let them ground me," he said to no one. The sky already remembers. When the war ended in May 1945, the noise stopped. But for Joe Mitchell, silence didn't sound like peace. The engines no longer roared through the French countryside. The smell of oil and gunpowder faded into the warm scent of spring grass. Yet every time he closed his eyes, he still heard the scream of the P-47s, still saw the streak of flames in the sky when a mix ran too hot. He wasn't court-martialed. Not exactly. The Army Air Forces didn't want headlines about a mechanic who'd illegally supercharged its fighters. Instead, they quietly transferred him to a maintenance depot in England while they reviewed field innovations. It was a polite exile. His miracle had worked, but it had broken too many rules for the bureaucracy to forgive. In the weeks that followed, pilots he'd saved began visiting him. Captain Dugan came first, still smelling faintly of aviation fuel, carrying a brown envelope stuffed with photos and reports. "They're calling it the Hellfire Advantage," Dugan said with a grin, unofficially, of course. Mitchell thumbed through the papers, graphs of performance gains, kill ratios, and flight logs, numbers, all of them screaming what he already knew. It worked. It had changed the tide. Then Dugan sat down a single photo. A group of pilots standing in front of a battered P-47. The word Hellfire painted under the nose. "We won," Dugan said simply. "You did this," Mitchell didn't smile. "No," he said quietly. "We just refused Toulouse." Back in the States months later, the war hero stories filled newspapers and radio broadcasts. There were parades, medals, interviews, but no one mentioned the mechanics. No one talked about the men who bent the rules until they broke because they had to. In a dim hangar in Texas, Mitchell returned to work at a civilian airfield. Every now and then, a veteran would stop by, recognize him, and say, "You're the Hellfire guy, right?" He'd nod, change the subject, and get back to his tools. One afternoon, a reporter tracked him down for a "Where Are They Now" article. She asked if he regretted it. The risk, the danger, the defiance. Mitchell wiped his hands on a rag and thought for a long time before answering. "Every bolt I turned, every drop I mixed. Broke a rule," he said. "But if I'd followed the book, half those boys wouldn't have come home. So yeah, I broke the rules, but the rules were written for peace, not survival." The quote never made the article. Too honest for print. Years passed. Technology evolved. Jets replaced propellers. Computers replaced grease-stained notebooks. The Hellfire mix was forgotten officially, but in pilot briefings and mechanic bars, the legend lived on. Some guy in France once made a P-47 climb like a jet, they'd whisper. He didn't ask permission either. When Mitchell finally retired, he left behind a single note pinned to his locker. It read, "Every great machine starts with one man who's willing to break it." That line found its way into an Air Force engineering lecture decades later. The professor didn't know the author's name, but the spirit behind it still powered the skies. Every test flight, every new design, every young mechanic who dared to ask, "What if we just try it?" The Hellfire mix had vanished from the manuals, but its lesson never did. In war and in peace, innovation always starts the same way, with someone bold enough to believe the impossible can soar. Joe Mitchell's story ended where it began, on a quiet runway beneath a Texas sunrise. He stood beside an old Thunderbolt on display, its metal dulled with age, its propeller frozen still. Visitors wandered past, reading plaques about heroes and aces, never realizing the man tightening a bolt on the stand was one of them. He didn't crave recognition. The distant hum of engines was enough. Every jet that thundered across the sky carried a trace of what he'd created. Not his formula, but his philosophy. The refusal to accept boundaries. The nerve to defy defeat, he once wrote in his logbook. Rules keep planes in the air. Breaking them keeps men alive. It wasn't pride. It was belief. Belief that even amid the chaos of war, one man with a wrench could tip the scales of history. When asked years later how he felt about being called insane, Mitchell just grinned. "Crazy gets things done," he said. "That's all I ever was." In the end, his legacy wasn't a secret fuel blend or a mended wing. It was a truth simple enough for every mechanic and pilot who followed him. Sometimes the impossible only needs someone daring enough to try. Next episode teaser. In the frozen skies over Europe, one bomber crew faced catastrophe when their controls locked solid, until a 19-year-old radio man crawled out onto the wing mid-flight.